Few aspects of television news appear to be as much of a mystery to producers as graphics. They're an essential device to help us tell a story. They're a way of visually representing often complex information and presenting images which we couldn't otherwise show. Good graphics will significantly enhance our storytelling. Bad graphics will confuse the viewer. Yet too many producers don't get as much as they could or should out of the system. They're not sure what a CSO involves, and if pressed would have trouble ordering a 3D. The purpose of this film is to demystify graphics. Hopefully it will help to provide you with a clearer understanding of what is involved in the different types. That way you'll be better informed when ordering them. That will mean we'll have better graphics, and the better our graphics, the better our output. Let's start with graphics that are displayed on screen at the same time as a presenter or correspondent. Insets are one example. They're images keyed behind the presenter to provide a visual pointer to the item that they're introducing. Producers should be active in the selection of images for inset. A powerful inset can help sell the story. Viewers often take more notice of what they see rather than what they hear. This is a good example of what we call a half-screen graphic. It's a good compromise between showing information on screen and having a correspondent live on location. A half-screen graphic requires proper planning, and the director needs to be involved at an early stage. Obviously, the correspondent needs to be framed so there's plenty of space to one side of them for the graphics. Here's another way of having a correspondent envisioned during a report. The correspondent here is in a virtual studio. They could also be standing within a full-screen graphic. The information appears around the correspondent by means of a CSO, which stands for Colour Separation Overlay. A CSO is a device that electronically superimposes a person or an object over another image. Here it's being used to talk about Christmas spending figures. It works because the correspondent is comparing like with like. The key to statistical graphics is that the information must be consistent. Big screen graphics are another way of allowing a presenter or correspondent to be in vision at the same time as the graphic. The big screen, sometimes called a video wall, is also likely to include some VT. It's a good device to help establish an interaction between the presenter and a correspondent.
Fergus, explain to us what went on.
There are two important things to remember when presenting big screen graphics. Firstly, they take time to prepare. Even a fairly straightforward one can take around 3 hours, and that can mean as much as 40% of the total graphic time available to a program. Secondly, because a person is on screen at the same time as the graphic, the area available for a graphic is inevitably smaller than it would be for a full-screen graphic. This means you need to take extra care with the text and images that you choose for a big screen. Make sure the screen isn't too crowded. Maps are perhaps the best known form and indeed obvious use of graphics. They place a story in its correct geographic context and are the ideal way to locate news events for the viewer. If you want to see the extent to which our maps have changed, look at the way a BBC television news bulletin illustrated the restricted areas during the last outbreak of foot and mouth disease back in 1968. Compared to how we illustrated the outbreak this year, having colour helps quite a lot and the technology is altogether more sophisticated. But there are important principles that apply to maps. Both the producer and the designer should strive to strike a balance between giving the viewer too much information and too little. If your map is for a regional audience or a world audience, then you need to take into account the degree of familiarity that the audience is likely to have with the story. This map is from a 1967 news bulletin. It shows Malta, but doesn't tell the viewer where in the world Malta is. And in the same bulletin we see a close-up map of Vietnam, but again without it being placed in any geographic context. This map introduced an item on breakfast about a fishing tragedy in a village called Eyemouth. Even though we're shown the Scottish borders, most viewers unfamiliar with that part of Scotland would probably still be none the wiser. If we were illustrating a story about a coach crash near York, this map would tell the viewer, even someone who lives in York, virtually nothing other than how to spell York properly. If the crash has just happened and we have no VT, this map is our only way of illustrating the story. So a title would add at least a little bit more information. and we should then give the viewer a better idea of where in the country York is. If we know that the crash happened on the A64, we can show that, providing a location on the road if possible. And if we know that the coach was carrying pensioners on a day trip to Scarborough, that too can be included. This is probably now the right balance of information. If we were to add that the incident occurred between the villages of Whitwell-on-the-Hill and Barton-le-Willows, and that after visiting Scarborough the pensioners were hoping to take tea in Filey before stopping off for a drink in Driffield, then we're probably putting too much information onto the map. So the rule is not to crowd the map. Back in 1967, graphics had limited scope as to how they could show information on screen. This is a typical graphic, text with no image.
All earning £13.5. Increases here from 12 to 29 shillings.
These days it's all a bit different. Some of the programmes deliberately have lots of information on screen. 60 Seconds is aimed at a youth audience, one that's used to absorbing information overload. But our more typical audience may find that there's a bit too much information here. As a rule, don't overcrowd the screen with information. These football graphics are very clear and straightforward. The aim is to give the viewer the information with nothing else on screen that may distract them. Sometimes the information is quite complicated, yet can still be put across in a clear way, as this graphic comparing the prices of various game consoles shows. This is another complex piece of information being put over in graphic form. There's a lot here for the viewer to absorb. There's plenty of information here too. There invariably is with business graphics, but this method, using the presenter boxed in vision, works well. Here's an example of how quotes can be used effectively in this day and age. The one has used a combination of VT, audio from a radio and text to create a strong graphic. Do remember that quotes need to be accurate and should tally with the script. If a quote has been edited, show it. By their nature, 3D or three-dimensional graphics take a long time to produce, so they're best suited to long-running stories that readily lend themselves to having a strong graphic dimension. Don't expect to order a 3D graphic and see it on air an hour later. This 3D is part of David Shukman's Afghanistan bunker. And here we see a 3D graphic that was created following the Airbus crash in New York. It's clearly a strong image, and 3D is an ideal way to illustrate a strong visual story for which we have no VT. However, you should be aware that the very realistic nature of 3D means that it can straddle the line between graphics and simulation, so we do need to be extra careful with the images we use. A phone comp is a graphic that's used to cover a live interview when the interviewee is only available on the phone, or to cover audio in a package when there's no VT. This is a good example of a phone comp with a correspondent. Graphics manage to find a grab of him in the right country. If you can't do that, make sure you use one of the correspondent in a neutral location. Whatever you do, please try and avoid this.
Good morning.
What's your reaction to this?
Well, I'm afraid I'm not a bit happy with this package. It's a terribly complicated stop-start package for animals.
Hopefully, this film has helped to give you a clearer picture of graphics. The more you understand graphics, the more you'll be able to use them to the full extent of their capability. And if there's just one message to get across, it's this. Putting images on the screen in a way that helps the viewer understand a story better need not be complicated. Keep it simple.
The port city of Dailam, from where the first reports came, is a good 90 miles north of the nuclear reactor, due to start operating later this year on the outskirts of Bashir.
The result? Panic. The oil price leapt up, and across the world, governments scrambled to find out what on earth was going on.
For years, Lebanon has been influenced by its large neighbour Syria. It was one of many parties involved in Lebanon's 15-year civil war. That ended in 1990, but 15,000 Syrian troops remain in Lebanon, and opposition to the considerable Syrian involvement in Lebanese affairs is growing. Rafik Hariri had recently joined the voices of opposition. It may explain why he was killed.
The 35 industrialised countries that have signed up are legally bound to cut their greenhouse gases by at least 5% from their 1990 level by 2012. Britain has agreed to go further with a 12.5% reduction, while the European Union has set a target of 8% and Japan is aiming for 6%. America initially agreed to a 7% reduction, but President Bush has subsequently refused to sign the protocol. A system of carbon trading has also been set up, allowing countries to reach their targets by effectively paying other countries to emit less carbon.
100 leading shares was down by almost 6 points. A short time ago, the pound was down against the dollar by more than 1.5 cents, and sterling was down against the euro by just over 1 1/10 cent.
Now, a man has been charged in connection with an alleged terrorist bomb plot in Britain. The man was arrested by anti-terrorism officers at Heathrow Airport after he flew in from Pakistan on Tuesday. The police aren't saying what the intended target was. Well, Gary Cotterill is at Scotland Yard. Gary, do you have any more details on this new detainee?
The man has been named as Salahuddin Amin. He's 29 years of age. He was arrested on Tuesday when he flew in on a flight from Pakistan into Heathrow's Terminal 4, was taken immediately to a high-security police station in central London, where he was charged under the Explosive Substances Act with conspiring with others to cause an explosion. Now, the timing of that conspiracy, it isn't the last few days or weeks, but it's actually around a year ago. The dates are given on the charge sheet as between October 2003 and March the 31st, 2004. Tonight, the man remains in custody.
The singer said he didn't want to give the claims much publicity, but said, "What I do know is that it is all about the education that parents give their children and the influences they receive, not putting the blame elsewhere."
The biggest winner in the election was a group of mostly Shia candidates who won nearly half of the votes. Shias are the largest group in Iraq's population and live mainly in the east of the country. Kurdish parties came second with a quarter of the votes. They mainly live in the north. But in the centre of the country, many people didn't vote at all. That's because it's an area dominated by Sunni Arabs, many of whom decided to ignore the elections.
So what's the shape of the results? Well, the biggest share of the vote went to the main Shia alliance, though 48% isn't quite the outright majority they'd hoped for. The Kurdish alliance came next. 26% gives them a powerful negotiating voice. But for the outgoing Prime Minister, Ayad Allawi, a disappointment. He came in third, only 14%. As for Sunni parties, their share is negligible. And when you look at the turnout, you can see why. In Shia areas, turnout was high, 72% in Basra, for instance. In Kurdish areas, it was higher still. In Arbil province, 84%. But look at mainly Sunni areas like Anbar province, where Fallujah is. Only 2% of eligible voters took part. Even so, there's a drive to try to get Sunni parties who boycotted the election to re-engage.
The results give no group absolute power. The Shiite alliance, blessed by Ayatollah Sistani, got nearly 50% of votes, which translates as about 130 seats, some 8 seats short of an overall majority. Next came the Kurdish coalition with just over 25%, or 69 seats, leaving Prime Minister Allawi's list third with less than 14% of votes, 37 seats. Countrywide turnout was 58%, up to 80% in parts of the mainly Shia south and Kurdish north. But in Anbar province, which includes Fallujah and is predominantly Sunni, only 2% voted, and only 17% in Nineveh and 29% in Salahuddin, also mainly Sunni areas.
As pieced together by investigators, the Marine Patrol was hit by a roadside bomb. 1 Marine was killed and 2 wounded. The Marines ordered an approaching taxi to stop, suspecting it had played a role in the bombing. When 4 men got out, the sergeant in charge dropped to one knee and fired. It is not clear if he gave orders to kill or simply set an example. But other Marines opened fire and then cleared nearby houses. It went on for 5 hours, and part of it was captured on video by another Marine unit in the area.
All this happened in the town of Ishaqi, 60 miles north of Baghdad. The raid began after a tip-off that an al-Qaeda supporter was visiting the house. American troops and helicopters arrived and a firefight apparently started. The Americans say the building collapsed under heavy fire and 4 bodies were found in the rubble. But the Iraqi police version is very different. They say the Americans entered the house while it was still standing and killed all 11 people, including the 3 children. Only then was the house destroyed.
Yet each day, 1 in 4 Americans visits a fast food restaurant. And this hunger for fast food isn't just in America. It's happening on a global basis. McDonald's alone operates more than 30,000 joints in over 100 countries on 6 continents and feeds more than 46 million people worldwide every day. That's more than the entire population of Spain.
When Burger King first opened, they had a 12-ounce small and a 16-ounce large. This 12-ounce is now kitty. The 16-ounce is now the small, the medium, the 32, and the 42. And this is across the board with all fast food places. Cars have introduced larger cup holders to accommodate those huge 7-Eleven double gulps, which are 64 ounces, a half gallon, and hold anywhere from 600 to 800 calories, depending on how much ice you put in.
A half gallon of soda.
A half gallon of soda for 1 person, 48 teaspoons of sugar.
The top 15 fattest cities in America, Texas has 5. We called 100 nutritionists all over America, and the results were not on track with the vast majority McDonald's talked about. Only 2 out of the 100 said you should eat fast food 2 times a week or more. 28 said once a week to once or twice a month, and 45 said you should never eat it. 95 of them agreed that it is a major contributor to the obesity epidemic sweeping America. Did everyone hear what he just said? We're part of the problem. The lobbyists for Coke, Heinz, Smucker's, Kellogg's, Nestle, Kraft, Hershey, Sara Lee, Cadbury, General Mills, Seagram, Welch's, Wise, Anheuser-Busch, Birds Eye, Lance, Campbell's, Carvel, Mars, Ocean Spray, Hormel, Dannon, and Pepsi said we're part of the problem. I think we're making some headway.